Welcome to another episode of Hot Media with Bob Mann. Every week on this program, we discuss the hottest controversies and the hottest issues in mass media. And we're on in all the audio platforms, on all of the audio platforms, whatever word is right there. And we're also in video on YouTube. And those of you watching YouTube right now can see my guest, Rem Rieder, who's one of our favorite long-term guests right here on the podcast. We'll be talking with Rem in just a couple of minutes. But I want to let you know what we're going to be talking about here on the episode. Vladimir Putin's immoral and murderous war against the people of Ukraine is actually hidden from most of his own population in Russia. That's what happens when you end up with a dictator. But the West and probably a majority of the world is getting the truth. But thanks to the journalists on the ground who are risking their lives to make sure this happens. That's one of the main subjects of this episode of the podcast, which is the episode title, Courageous War Reporting. And it really is courageous, and it is really bold. And Rem, I guess, you've always been an advocate for journalists in America and for free press, but it really is coming in to focus now just how important it is, that watchdog role.
That's absolutely right. It's easy to sometimes get cynical about journalists, and a lot of people are. Polls show that there's not a very high rate of confidence in journalists, and former President Trump did his best to help that trend along with his constant attacks on fake news and that kind of thing. And there are shortcomings on some parts of the press, we have a free press enshrined in our government for a reason, and a First Amendment, and it's, as you say, for the watchdog role, for helping people in the democracy understand what's going on, and the Ukraine situation, as you say, really in bold relief shows the importance of that. Because you have, on the one hand, Russia, where citizens are getting only propaganda, and someone who, a very bold Russian journalist who went on the stage behind the presenter and put up a sign saying all that the people were being told was propaganda, has now been accused of being a British spy. On the other hand, we're lucky enough to have, so far at least, a free press.
Yeah, at least for now.
Yeah, to enjoy it while we have it. And second, though, so important, what you pointed out, is the bravery of the journalists covering war. And what's interesting, I was just talking to my students at Widener about that. We've talked that a number of times. And one of the things that amazes them, that is part of your job, you would go out and, in a sense, risk your life to cover combat. And yet, the world needs to see this. They need to know, if the Russians are attacking civilian targets, that has to be brought home. And the danger is underscored by the fact that already, I think, 5 journalists have died covering this conflict,
including an American, a freelancer who was pretty well known.
That's right. And over the years, we've often had journalists who specialize in war coverage, who were drawn to it. And you'll remember there was a wonderful journalist named Marie Colvin, an American who reported mostly for British news outlets. She had lost an eye covering a war, but went on covering war for many years till she died covering the conflict in Syria. So the amount of bravery and the commitment to telling the truth is extraordinary. And yeah, this is a terrific episode to remind all of us how important journalists are, and how doing it right often involves paying a price.
Absolutely. The ultimate price in many cases. I did a quick introduction because I'm just assuming that many people who watch this podcast or listen to it as subscribers know who you are. But for those who don't, I need to do a full introduction of you, Rem. Of course, you are a regular on Hot Media, which is very prestigious, of course. But Rem is also adjunct professor of journalism at Widener University in Pennsylvania. And he has been on not only this show, but its predecessor, let's consider the source that we had for years on Sirius XM radio, in his roles as editor at large and media columnist for USA Today, and previous to that, editor and senior vice president of the American Journalism Review. This is a person who has certainly worked all sides of the journalism profession. Rem, you made a very clear case for the courage of so many journalists. What has impressed you the most so far as an individual case, beyond the people, of course, who gave their lives, but some of the reporting, some of the locations where people chose to set up have really amazed me, because to stay right in the midst of Kyiv is amazing, but even to be anywhere near it is mind-boggling. What has impressed you most so far?
Well, I think, this is a different kind of war than we've been used to in recent years. It's kind of like an old school war between opposing armies. As what we've had in post-Cold War is more insurgencies. And in this war, particularly a full-scale attack on by one country on another, there's really no place to hide. There aren't very many safe havens. You don't know where the next attack is coming, and so almost so much of the country is a battle zone, and journalists have been, in many instances, as you say, have been very brave to be close to the action. And one of the things I was reading about, a kind of account of the danger over there, and one of the things is you could go down this road 5 or 6 days in a row and everything's fine. The next day it's being shelled. And so it's just the unpredictability and the fact that there's not like the battle for something or other. It's these random attacks on places in Ukraine, and it's gotten worse because the Russians I clearly Putin did not expect anything like this. He expected a quick knockout victory, and now quite a bit of time has gone on and things have gone very badly for him. And we've seen kind of the tactic of a desperate person is these attacks on civilians. We had a maternity hospital hit, and obviously we have certainly in our history, civilian attacks, but most of those are accidental. Those, it doesn't excuse them, but
Right.
it's we've hit the wrong target, or the drone is going, or whatever it is. These, by all accounts, are intentional attacks to inflict pain on the Ukrainian people, because the Ukrainian army and military forces have done so well. And that kind of circles back to your point. What it means is every place is a place of danger to cover this conflict.
What impressed me the most actually was early in the war, which now, as we record this on March 25th, is almost a month to the day. And in the middle of Kyiv, where it was like, well, we know that the Russians are moving. And then all of a sudden, from a live shot on CNN, you would see the reporter turn around and say, I'm hearing explosions now, and we're in the middle of Kyiv. To actually see the war begin, at least they know to some degree what they're dealing with. But at that point, they just stayed in there and hung in there, not knowing what the extent was, how fast it was coming, and how fast it was moving. Now, again, I really want this to be a very pro-journalism message, but just one criticism, and maybe it's not a criticism, maybe it's legitimate. The amount of speculation that goes on in terms of what Putin is going to do next. What about the possibility of nuclear war? What about the possibility of the use of chemical weapons? I guess when you have 24/7 news, that becomes an issue. But to some degree, I guess you can't deal in anything but speculation, because this could get a lot worse.
It really could. But on the other hand, I think you hit on it, that with the 24/7 world of cable news in particular, there's a lot of time to fill, and you can't just show the same footage over and over again. And kind of what a lot of cable does is speculate, and endless political punditry, that kind of thing. And I agree with you. Some of that kind of makes me uneasy. This, a lot of the speculation about really dangerous consequences based on not much. People, I would say, don't necessarily have a lot more inside information than you and I do about what Putin intends to do. And in a way, it's one of those times when restraint really can be a plus. Obviously, as you say, you don't want to, if something is possible and there's a real risk, you don't want people to be blindsided. But I think the constant harping on it can really have a bad effect on the populace. It could really get people overly worried, and if there's a real reason for them to be, that's great. But if it's just, as you say, speculation, that's unfortunate. But it's kind of it's so rampant in our society, both in cable and one of my many character flaws is I'm a Twitter addict, and at Twitter, I find there's an awful lot of very smart stuff. There's also a lot of the people who were for 2 years were epidemiologists have suddenly become Kremlinologists. It's amazing how much they know about everything.
Well, I did see somebody being interviewed the other day. I'm forgetting which show because, of course, I'm jumping around all the time. And he
Right,
goes, as a Kremlinologist, he goes, no, I'm a journalist. I'm not a Kremlinologist. He kind of
right,
corrected himself
right.
and straightened that out. But you mentioned something that this is an old school war in so many ways. Not only do we have nations rather than groups or terrorist organizations or insurgencies, but we also have clear cut, I think, for the first time since World War II, good guy, bad guy, because in our experience in Vietnam, we had a situation in which our news media started to report on the things that we were doing wrong and maybe that we shouldn't belong there. And that even included Walter Cronkite. This is, in many ways, not only a throwback to war in Europe from the 1940s, but a throwback to the kind of war we had in the 1940s and really haven't had ever since. Stalemate in Korea, not knowing exactly why we're in Vietnam or who we're fighting after 9/11.
Yeah, or the Iraq War, even where you know we ended up invading on a false rationale. Uh, and yes, this is an awfully clear cut. You have an evil nation invading another nation, and if you can't get outraged about that, that's on you. But we've had this kind of really disconcerting thing on the kind of the fringes of the Republican Party. But what has been Liz Cheney, no less than Liz Cheney, is called the Putin wing of the Republican Party.
Oh,
Uh,
and I've seen it. Tucker Carlson at Saturday Night Live had a great line and said in the weekend update, Colin Jost said Russia has invaded Ukraine backed by its allies Belarus and Tucker Carlson.
that's
I mean,
perfect.
yeah, but I mean, who would ever think this is so clear cut?
Yeah,
How can when right wing media literally waves the flag in its graphic to actually speak in support of Vladimir Putin? Is that simply because Trump adores him?
well, yeah, I think that's part of it, and part of it is uh, as Trump seems to have a pattern of liking a certain kind of authoritarian strongmen. This isn't the only one.
Right. He
Um,
said he fell in love with Kim Jong Un.
Right, and that's a challenge. I mean, I'm not sure who could do it at gunpoint. Um, but
That and him and Dennis Rodman, I guess, are the only two.
made for each other. Uh, but I think there part of it all is this fascinating with strongmen. And yes, uh, Trump through his whole presidency and up till 20 minutes ago was very supportive of Putin. And one of the real alarming things to me is this is the is part of this minimizing the significance and this idea of sort of flirting with the idea that the Ukrainians are Nazis. I mean, one of Putin's talking points, and
With
the
a
whole
Jewish president who
with a Jewish
in a
president.
country that was ravaged by Nazi
Yeah,
Germany.
and it's
Amazing.
true that Ukraine does have quite a history of anti-Semitism, as does Russia. Um, all four of my Jewish Ukrainian grandparents saw that firsthand and came here. But one of the things that also, yes, it seems like it should be clear cut, good guy, bad guy, but it's also a reminder of the importance of fact checking and not just doing stenography. because they're periodically, whether it's from Marjorie Taylor Greene or famously from a former Democratic presidential candidate, Tulsi Gabbard, who basically said a big part of this, why Putin's upset, is that the U.S. and Ukraine have these bio labs in Ukraine where they're creating diseases like COVID. I mean,
Oh,
crazy conspiracy stuff, which the Gabbard, who's I guess from the Democratic Putin wing, uh, expounded on this, and then in the infinite Putin loop got a lot of exposure from your man Tucker Carlson, uh,
mm-hmm.
and it's at those times it's so important. That's actually a big Republican talking or a Putin talking point. So it's kind of uh, echoing enemy propaganda, although we're not at war with Ukraine, um, and it's why you just can't do. If Putin says this, you then really every time this comes up, whether it's Putin or Tulsi Gabbard or Carlson or Marjorie Taylor Greene, there needs to be the fact checking right there in that story. Making clear that there is no evidence for this, and there are the labs that it's kind of conflating it with labs that are there that were there to try to deal with some chemical weapons left over from the old Soviet Union to kind of counteract their dangers, not to create COVID.
It is absolutely stunning and it is amazing. And we've got to be careful here who ends up being president of the United States because it can be very quick. It was fairly quick for Putin to take what was at least a democracy in formation after communism, after the Soviet Union, and just crush free press and just crush independent media and put people in jail for a 15-year sentence should they question him on television, online, or in the newspapers. It
Yeah,
doesn't take long, does it?
that doesn't at all. That law you talked about went into effect really quickly, basically saying anything that is considered fake news can get you in jail for 15 years, and the government decides what's fake news. And it's scarily close to, I think, Trump's view of what he would like to do. I mean, it's how he sees the press. And yes, it can happen really fast, and the result is you have a big populace over there getting essentially 24/7 propaganda, uh, and all kinds of news outlets being blocked, and yeah, for a number of years, you're right. There were elements of an independent press in Russia. Putin would crack down on television, which but for a while I mean, there was a period where there were a lot of murders of newspaper journalists from independent papers, but those papers and some websites were allowed to slither along for a while. Now, as you said, a complete shutdown on independent news, and that's a horrible danger there. And you could see it's with some of the attitudes we've seen about the media here, we've got nothing to take for granted.
Absolutely not. And it can happen fast. It can happen by the middle of 2025, for all we know. Um, just before we leave, we're running a little short of time here. Ever since you first came on the predecessor of this program, which is about 15 years ago at this point, believe it or not, one of the things you always stressed was fact checking. And you just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, people should do their own fact checking. Please give us some leads as to the best places to fact check. I mean, to me, I trust CNN. I trust the New York Times. I don't think I need to fact check them on some of these things about what I see with my own eyes in Ukraine. But if Tucker happens to be telling you that Putin is a good guy, maybe you can check it out someplace. What the truth is, where are some of the truly objective fact checking opportunities?
Right. As you said, I've been talking about this for a long time. And what's been impressive to me is the growth in recent years of fact checking by the mainstream media itself. For years, a place called factcheck.org at the University of Pennsylvania, where I was fortunate enough to spend 2020 fact checking the Trump Biden campaign. They kind of pioneered a lot of this. And another outfit called PolitiFact, that's owned by the Tampa Bay Times, came along a few years later. the Washington Post for years now has had a terrific fact checking operation. It's called the Fact Checker, and uh, since then, other outfits have gotten into the game. CNN actually has a really good full time fact checker who they hired from one of the Toronto papers because he was fact checking Trump full time for them. But what's been exciting is you see the fact checking in the stories themselves, and in this kind of news environment we're in, that's important. And that's kind of what I was getting at. If Trump makes some outrageous allegation, or perhaps it's a true allegation, who knows, or Putin, or if Biden gets something wrong, and Biden can, you don't have anything near the level of untruth we had with Trump, but he can be very sloppy about things. So a lot of news organizations do the actual fact checking in this initial story, which is, it won't be the depth of the fact check you'll get from factcheck.org or PolitiFact or some of these other operations. But it's really critical to do that, and for people to check a number of sources, because I mean, I have a lot of confidence in CNN and New York Times, but they're capable of getting things very wrong as well.
No, fact checking is great, and be objective about it yourself and what you're going to check. Just really quickly, I know that, and I still think it was appropriate that we devoted so much to Ukraine and to how important it is to have journalism to be a witness for us and to be our eyes and ears. But again, another very shameful exhibition on Capitol Hill when it came to the Supreme Court Justice nominee questioning. Talk a little bit about that coverage.
Sure, and I know we don't have time, so a lot of time left. So, but one thing I think, and I'm glad you brought that up. It's really good to stress that again we had, some of the questions of, by all accounts, a very distinguished nominee with a terrific record. There was a lot of questioning from Republican members about trying to suggest that the nominee was soft on pornography, and that her sentencing of child pornography cases was way too lenient. And again, a bunch of fact checks suggested that wasn't the case, that her sentences were kind of in the normal range. But there was a lot of demagoguery going on about that from Josh Hawley, from Lindsey Graham. And two things. Sure enough, that was a surefire way to get exposure on Fox. The senators that concentrated on that got a lot of time there. But it also made it important for other outlets to, when they characterize this, some would say it's a partisan brawl. It wasn't a brawl. A brawl needs two brawlers. And the nominee wasn't doing much brawling. I thought she handled herself with amazing patience and restraint. And I think it's important reminder that the language is key. That we're so quick at a lot of our political coverage to frame everything as a partisan brawl and kind of to equate everything and get into some false equivalency. Sometimes everybody is doing it, but often they're not. And in this case, with a lot of what I feel was outrageous questioning, it was important to call the senators doing that on what they were doing and not reduce it to our too frequent fallback of partisan brawl.
Yeah, sometimes they try to reduce it to being sports coverage. Not that we don't
That's
love
exactly
sports
right.
coverage, especially as we record that St. Peter's is still alive, which is very interesting and
Go
amazing.
Peacocks.
And heading down toward your hometown area there.
Exactly right. That's a
And
great good story.
just one last thing, you love when there's any kind of revival among newspapers. You mentioned something in an email before we started recording about some activity in Baltimore.
Yeah, there's a new outlet that's about to launch called the Baltimore Banner. And the backstory, I'll make it quick, is the Baltimore Sun used to be a very distinguished local paper, locally owned. Was so many papers where fell into the hands of a chain, but at first it was a good chain. Times Mirror, the ownership changed. It's now owned by as too many newspapers are, by essentially a hedge fund, which took over Tribune, which is where the paper had ended up. And their staff is a shell of what it was. And a very wealthy guy named Stuart Bainham tried to buy the Sun when it was being spun off, when Tribune was being spun off. They tried to buy the whole company and couldn't. So what he's doing, he's launching a digital operation called the Baltimore Banner. He's hired to run it somebody from the LA Times. He's picking off people from the Baltimore Sun. And unlike a lot of the local news efforts, digital, which I love, like we have a couple here in Philly, but they have like 3 or 4 reporters. It's not the scope of what you need to cover a whole region. They're great, but they're very supplemental. And he's putting up to 50 million of his own money into it, and he's going to hire not a staff of the size of the good old days, but a substantial staff, it seems, with substantial journalists to give the Sun, as it keeps getting cut back, a run. And I just love to see new digital initiatives like that, particularly focusing on local news.
Well, I'm always so happy to have you here in the program. By the way, I never remember this in pre-interview prep, but I do the live to tape version for video. So please hang on after I sign off so I can talk to you.
Okay,
And
sure.
I can edit the audio, but not the video. But thank you very much, Rem, because you have great insights into the field of journalism and how important it is to our American democracy.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. I always enjoy talking to you.
Absolutely. And we will see you again. All right. That is Rem
Right.
Rieder. And Rem is one of our most frequent guests, and he is an adjunct professor of journalism at Widener University in Pennsylvania, and has been over the course of his career in many big jobs. Most prominent of them, editor at large and media columnist for USA Today, and editor and senior vice president of the American Journalism Review. That's it for this episode of Hot Media with Bob Mann. Please join us every week, and please subscribe. We're on every audio platform: Odyssey, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. But we also are on video on YouTube. Some of you are probably watching this right now, and those people can actually see on the screen my website, www.bobmannhotmedia.com, BOBMANN media.com. And also, please follow me on Twitter at my handle at BobMannMedia. Each week on this program, we discuss the most important and interesting issues in mass media, journalism, and entertainment both. So please join us on a regular basis. We pretty much do the show every week, try to publish as best we can on Fridays. And please just remember to join us here each week, if you can, on Hot Media. Thanks.